On March 11, 2024, a historic moment unfolded at NATO headquarters in Brussels, as the Swedish flag, a symbol of over 200 years of neutrality, was hoisted alongside those of its new allies. This act signified Sweden's pivot from its long-standing policy of non-alignment, a stance steadfastly maintained since the Napoleonic Wars. Despite the ravages of World Wars I and II, Sweden had remained a bastion of neutrality. But now, as the latest member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Sweden commits to defending its fellow 31 members if conflict arises. What spurred this dramatic shift in Swedish defense policy? Could this development hint at looming threats that could unravel the peace in Europe? Join us as we delve into NATO's origins, its purpose, the controversy surrounding membership, and what Sweden's accession means for the future of European security. But before we dive deeper, let's turn back the pages to a pivotal era that reshaped our world, the aftermath of World War II. As the last fires of World War II burned out and a tentative peace settled over Europe, countries were immediately keen to band together with the goal of preventing this kind of tragedy from ever happening again. Over the last 35 years, Pandora's box had been opened twice. Millions of people, both soldiers and civilians, were dead. Economies were in ruins. A generation of children would be raised without parents. Fascist rule had swept through Germany and had narrowly failed at taking control of an entire continent. Nuclear weapons, capable of leveling entire cities, had gone from being a distant theory to tumbling out of a plane over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a matter of a few years. To the east, a sleeping giant had been woken in Russia as communism looked ready to fill the boots left by Hitler's men. Britain and France quickly signed the Treaty of Dunkirk in 1947. Two historic rivals laid aside their differences in the blink of an eye to guarantee mutual support in the instance of another war with Russia or Germany. A year later, in March 1948, the group expanded to include their closest neighbors Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. This little corner of Europe was known as the Western Union or Brussels Treaty Organizations. The WU members had all fought closely together throughout World War II. Their men had fought in the same trenches, and their leaders strategized together in the war rooms. In short, they trusted one another completely. But these nations knew that a Third World War could far eclipse their firepower, even when standing together. Against the burgeoning might of communism, they would need a much more powerful ally. Talks began with the United States that month. Fortunately, the United States were on the same wavelength as the BTO members from the start. That year, there had been a coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia, stoked by Communist Russia, one of the first conflicts in the Cold War. The US's foreign policy under the Truman Doctrine was to protect the world from communist aggression through forming international treaties. They fast-tracked discussions, and just 1 year later, on 4th of April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. The WU members Britain, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands all signed. Now they were joined not only by the United States, but also Canada, Portugal, Italy, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. NATO was born, and right from the outset, it was nothing to be sniffed at. The combined military strength of all these nations was enough to give any warring party pause for thought. A slightly kicked border fence in northern Norway would now suddenly not only be met by Norwegian consternation, but the full might of the US, Canada, the UK, France, and many more. A military hierarchy was established in due time, with practices like standardized equipment between members and the appointment of a NATO Secretary General, and joint military exercises and training between nations. NATO was fast becoming the most powerful alliance to have ever existed. Everyone would want to be part of it then, surely. Why didn't the whole world join right away? NATO was founded with some rules that are still in place to this day. One of the simplest was that the only countries allowed to join were those in Europe. This eliminates longtime Western allies like Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, and Mexico. Not in Europe, not in NATO. Sorry, not sorry. Except the US and Canada are in NATO. As founding members, they were able to set the rules the way they liked. This treaty had been to secure peace in Europe specifically, and so at the time that was the focus, and that rule just stuck. So that answers the questions as to why X hasn't joined NATO for most of the world, and leaves us to look at Europe specifically. How did NATO grow over the next few decades? Remember we mentioned that NATO had appointed a Secretary General. His name was Hastings Ismay, a baron from the UK, and he summarized NATO's early goals in the most blusteringly British way possible. In his words, it was there to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Greece and Turkey were keen on those values and joined as fast as they could, making them the first members to join who hadn't been there from the beginning. But by 1955, it was clear that NATO needed to re-evaluate its goals when it came to that last part: keep the Germans down. The Germany of World War II was not the Germany before them at that point. Fractured into East and West Germany following the war, the former had adopted communism, while the latter aligned itself with the West's free market capitalism. At that point in time, West Germany was looking a lot like an ally. The NATO members had learned from the mistakes of the past. Following World War I, the Treaty of Versailles that Germany was forced to sign had bankrupted the country for decades, leading to a festering belly of resentment which gave birth to Nazism. What about instead of keeping Germany down, we make this newfound relationship official and join forces with them? This way, there will never be another war against Germany as long as NATO stands. So West Germany was next to join, and it worked. Joining NATO was of course not the sole factor in Germany's resurgence in Europe and wholehearted rejection of fascism, far from it, but it gives us a prime example of the biggest strength of NATO: unity. Members, despite their differences, are able to pull in the same direction. But it was not all good news. West Germany's ascension into NATO pushed the Soviet Union over the edge. Steadily growing weaker compared to the alliance, the Soviet Union responded in kind with their own version of NATO, the Warsaw Pact. They united a force of mostly Eastern European nations in direct opposition to NATO. Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania all joined. As much as NATO was helping to bring unity in Europe, it was also bringing just as much division. Like team captains picking their favorites before a game of football, NATO and the Soviet Union were starting to gather their allies ahead of another world war. Who would gather the stronger set? Who would blink first? NATO was at a crossroads. An alliance that was supposed to bring peace looked to be stoking tensions more than anything else. The Cold War was rumbling away, and the UK and US were taking active roles across the world in furthering their interests. This led to the first real breakaway from NATO, as France took a step back in 1966. They did not officially leave, but instead stepped down from NATO's integrated command force. The last thing they wanted was for the US and UK to overstep in the Cold War and ignite a direct conflict. This would drag France and every other NATO member into a war they didn't want to be in, so they pulled out and created their own nuclear deterrent in the process, granting them greater strategic independence should the Cold War spark into something more. The tension that existed in NATO at this time carried on throughout the rest of the Cold War. The alliance had never really been tested. It was a great idea in theory, but if the Soviet Union did decide to attack a NATO member, would everyone actually come to their aid? Under the threat of nuclear war, it was all up in the air. Only one more nation joined NATO during this period: Spain. You might expect Spain to have been a member already. Today, Spain would be a natural fit alongside Portugal, France, Germany, and the UK. But this was following the Second World War, and Spain was a very different country politically. Up until 1975, Spain was a dictatorship under Francisco Franco. Franco had been a supporter of the Nazis during World War II, and so relations between him and NATO had always been strained. After his death, however, Spain transitioned to democracy. Even though the country had hosted US military bases and formed a number of agreements with NATO members over the last few decades, the road from this point to their NATO membership was far from straightforward. Political tensions and a failed attempted coup introduced an element of chaos to proceedings, but the short story is that by 1982, Spain had joined NATO. One of the rules that NATO has for joining members is that they must be stable countries. Any conflicts, civil wars, and civil unrest needs to be set straight before they can join. It's a testament to Spain's popularity that they were granted NATO membership during such a volatile period in the country's history, and it's most certainly a source of frustration for others today, but more on that later. By the 1990s, everything had shifted again. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The revolutions of 1989 that had sprung up across the world in protest against communist rule had done the trick. The Cold War was over. East Germany was adopted into NATO by default as the country was absorbed by West Germany. Hastings-Ismay's original goals for NATO were obsolete. The Americans were staying in for good. The Russians had fallen. The Germans were now on their side. With the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union had left an enormous amount of real estate on the table. During the 1990s, NATO shifted quite notably. Largely a passive defensive agreement up until this point, they started to wade into political conflicts on peacekeeping missions. They intervened in Bosnia from 1992 to 1995, and again in the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1999. In 2001, they triggered Article 5 for the first and only time following the 9/11 attacks in the US, meaning all NATO members had to come to the US's aid in responding to the attack. Their actions during this period muddied the waters for many about NATO's purpose and morality, with a number of countries begging the question of who were they to intervene in a conflict that didn't concern them. There was another shift on the horizon too, however. A number of disgruntled countries, having long suffered under oppressive Soviet rule, were about to gain independence. A whole host of countries were about to start applying for NATO, and they needed to be ready with their strategy for this new era. NATO issued guidelines in 1999 to help new members join. These included individualized membership action plans for Albania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, North Macedonia, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. NATO has a number of hoops to jump through for a nation to be able to join, as we've touched on already. Now will be a good time to hit on a third rule for joining NATO that we have not yet mentioned. In order to join, you need the unanimous support of every other member. A simple majority is not enough. Everyone needs to agree to admit you. So you must be in Europe, be stable and peaceful, and get unanimous support. With that in mind, let's run through the spree of new members that joined from the 1990s onwards. The Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland were the first to jump at the opportunity to join NATO in 1999. Each of them had previously been invaded by the Soviet Union or the Nazis over the last century and had their independence stripped from them. In NATO, they will be given the chance to exist under their own leadership, with plenty of freedoms, whilst enjoying the security of guaranteed protection by some of the world's strongest militaries. 5 years later, in 2004, another batch of former Soviet-controlled nations in Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia, aided by their NATO-provided action plan, joined, forming a fairly comprehensive NATO wall along Eastern Europe. This was a massive blow to Vladimir Putin, who was newly in power. Putin, a former KGB agent, has long fantasized about resurrecting the Soviet Union to its former glory. These new memberships were a blow because they gave NATO a strong tactical advantage in Europe, pinning Russian influence back further than it had ever been. Putin was only enraged more as the Eastern Wall was completed in the north, with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all joining that same year and on the same date, March 29, 2004. In 2004 alone, Putin had lost 7 countries to NATO as the West shored up its position against the possibility of a Soviet resurgence. This position was finalized 5 years later, with Albania's membership finally being granted. The last of the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact members had now joined NATO, but it hadn't been an easy process. Remember how we mentioned that Spain got away with political instability when joining NATO? Albania had no such luck. They were one of the nations to be given individualized guidelines for joining NATO a full decade ago. In 1997, Albania had been plunged into civil unrest following economic collapse. A huge proportion of the country's economy had been propped up by a set of pyramid schemes, which when they fell ignited a conflict that lasted half a year. It took Albania a very long time to recover and return to the level of stability that NATO deemed acceptable. A similar story had been playing out in Croatia, who took a long time to establish lasting peace after their war for independence. Moldova has been battling instability with heavy Russian influence and abject poverty gripping much of the nation since their independence. Despite there being a vocal portion of the country wanting to join NATO and the EU, Moldova is to retain the neutral status set down in its constitution and, unlike Ukraine, is not seeking NATO membership. Azerbaijan is locked into a long-standing dispute over territory with Armenia, which would eliminate them from contention too. Both Albania and Croatia finally got their seats in NATO in 2009, whilst the others mentioned are still facing an uphill battle to join NATO. But Albania and Croatia were not the only big NATO newcomers from that year. They were joined by a familiar old face. In France, the political winds had changed. Nicolas Sarkozy had been elected a couple of years earlier and was staunchly in favor of NATO. His vision for France was that they have a prominent seat on the world stage, swinging their weight around in NATO and making key strategic decisions alongside their European counterparts. He was also convicted of corruption after leaving office, but the job was done. France was back. We've nearly got all of our members now, just a few more to go. For almost a decade, things were quiet in terms of joining members. We have to fast forward all the way to 2017, when Montenegro joined for our next member. They have a complicated history with NATO, as the alliance had damaged the country in the late 1990s with their political interference. But even then, Montenegro needed NATO more than it disliked it. By this point, NATO had become so powerful that even though it was not a country in its own right, it had a huge sway over small nations. Places like Montenegro, Albania, Croatia, and others have spent the bulk of their independent years struggling to meet the high bar for entry. No country has had to bend over backwards to earn their membership more than North Macedonia. Before 2019, they were simply known as Macedonia. They applied to join NATO, but thanks to that unanimous approval rule, were rejected. So who rejected them? It turns out Greece has territory within its borders that share the name Macedonia, as it was once a united historical region in its own right. Greece feared that Macedonia would one day seek to reunite with Greek Macedonia, since they had a name claim to it. The rules are the rules, and so until Greece would approve them, Macedonia was stuck. So they had to change the name of their entire country to North Macedonia just to earn their membership. Macedonia had started proceedings in 1999, but they weren't full members until 2020, a full 21 years. This is one major criticism that many smaller countries level at NATO, and for good reason. It's so massive and powerful that they can't not be in it. On their own, they cannot confidently secure their borders from a Russian invasion, but they are completely at the whim of any and all NATO members who may have a grudge or disagreement with them. This is a good chance to tick off some more countries that haven't been able to join NATO as they fall into this category. Armenia technically falls just outside of Europe, so they would have difficulty applying for NATO under the geographic limitations, despite the fact that Turkey, a long-standing NATO member, recognized Armenia after its declaration of independence on the 21st of September 1991. But here's another country whose statehood is not officially recognized by a number of European countries: Kosovo. Slovakia, Romania, Spain, and Greece all refuse to recognize its independence, and so their membership is dead in the water. Cyprus is a country split in two. Turkey heavily backs northern Cyprus, and so would almost definitely automatically refuse Cyprus's application to NATO. So this brings us to NATO's two newest members, Finland and Sweden. Since World War II for Finland and the Napoleonic Wars for Sweden, both countries have pursued neutrality unflinchingly. They sidestepped the Cold War and focused their efforts on peace and stability within their own borders, as well as building up their own very capable, independent military forces. So what changed? When Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, it was the start of another new era for NATO. Any interview you see with Vladimir Putin regarding what he calls his special military operation will inevitably turn into a tirade from him against NATO aggression. The Warsaw Pact, that was the Soviet Union's answer to NATO, crumbled, and all of its members abandoned ship and joined his enemy. Putin has seen his list of allied countries grow shorter and shorter as the decades have rolled by. At this point, he has almost no one left. Russia has since established a new NATO equivalent, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. The CSTO has just 6 nations, to NATO's 32, however, all post-Soviet states: Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. While Armenia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan all will be able to apply for NATO geographically, their membership in the CSTO disqualifies them automatically. Serbia is not part of this, but is an observer state in Russia's alliance, and so gets the same treatment. Not that they would mind much, given they also carry the scars of past conflicts with NATO. Putin sees NATO creeping closer and closer to his borders as an existential threat, and that may have been what triggered his invasion of Ukraine. Let's look at Georgia as an example. Georgia, a former Soviet state, was getting close to joining NATO, but were being held back by their ongoing conflict with Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008. As long as the conflict was ongoing, they would not be able to join. So Russia invaded Georgia, backing the Abkhazian and Ossetian forces and fanning the flame for ongoing instability. Georgia today is no closer to joining NATO than they were all those years ago. In fact, they are likely even further away. So when Ukraine, Russia's large European neighbor, started to move towards NATO membership, Putin got there first. If he let Ukraine join NATO, he would not be able to fight them without incurring the wrath of most of the Western world. By invading them before, he was able to completely remove the option for them to join from the table, whilst also guaranteeing that Ukraine would not receive any on-the-ground NATO backing. In a way it worked. Ukraine cannot join NATO while being actively at war. Putin got his way, but he failed in another key area: Finland and Sweden. Think back to NATO's Eastern European wall. It has a gap in it, and a pretty big one at that. All the way in the north, Russia's border with Finland was wide open territory. NATO may have shut down most of Europe, but there was still an angle he could work to get through, except Putin misjudged everything. Quite badly, in fact. Intelligence sources have said that when Putin invaded Ukraine, he expected the entire conflict to take just 10 days. Yet here we are in the war's 3rd year, and it's showing no signs of reaching its end anytime soon. His sudden, shocking invasion did enough to push Finland and Sweden over the edge into joining NATO. Both nations, as a result of his actions, now see membership in the organization as vital to national security, a view they didn't have unanimously before the war. Not only this, but his clearly unethical actions have shown that this Russia poses a moral threat to the world that they want to actively stand against. This could have been mitigated somewhat if he had been able to invade Finland quickly enough. NATO membership takes a while to go through after all, but he had misjudged Ukraine so catastrophically that he hasn't had the manpower to even consider fighting a war on another front, giving Finland all the time in the world to join NATO. Other countries, however, are still holding out on their neutral positions. Rounding off our list of countries not in NATO, Austria, Switzerland, Ireland, and Malta are all neutral nations, refusing to enter into conflict. Unlike Finland and Sweden, they are at a lesser threat from Russian invasion, as they have a kind of NATO sheltering from their neighbors who are shielding them from invasion. In the event of another world war, however, would these nations need to reevaluate their positions? Possibly. And lastly, we have the microstates, the Vatican, Andorra, Liechtenstein, San Marino, and Monaco. Each of these are tiny, and while their inhabitants all have strong individual identities, they simply do not have the military strength to be on the radar of most countries. In fact, they were not on the radar of the NATO founding members at all, who didn't really make any provisions for these microstates to have a route to join. As such, none of them have ever made it very far. Which leaves us with the final pair, Finland and Sweden. On the 4th of April 2023, Finland completed that move, followed by Sweden on the 11th of March 2024. Just like that, Putin's door in the north has firmly shut. The lines in the sand have been drawn between NATO and the CSTO, and the advantage is heavily in NATO's favor. Russia has been backed into a corner almost completely on the European front. While this is good news for the West, it's a double-edged sword. As the old saying goes, if you corner a dog in a dead-end street, eventually it will turn and bite. What do you think? Will the growing geopolitical and military prowess of NATO tip the scales in the Ukraine conflict? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out War is Coming to Sweden, or click this other video instead.